In that deep silence coming from the depths of the forest, you sense that something is moving. You cannot see it, but you know it. The slight rustle among the leaves, a low, muffled sound coming from deep within the soil, is too obvious to be explained by the wind. For a moment, you stop and listen closely, because sometimes nature warns you before it reveals itself. And this is exactly where the story of the wild boar begins, right in the middle of a silent encounter that has lasted for thousands of years between humans and a presence that is unseen but always there. The wild boar is an animal that most people believe they know from only a few seconds of encounter, a silhouette that suddenly appears on the road in the dark, tracks noticed in a field in the morning, or fear-filled stories passed from ear to ear. These brief moments create a strong but incomplete image of it. Yet this animal has a past that is far too complex to fit into a few seconds, and far too deep to be described in just a few words. To truly understand the wild boar requires looking at it not from where we see it, but from the entirety of nature. Throughout history, humans have domesticated what resembled them, controlled what they feared, and labeled what resisted them as dangerous. The wild boar stood outside all three. It neither fully submitted nor was completely eradicated, nor maintained a fully harmonious distance from humans. For this reason, the narratives about it are often sharp. It is either completely demonized or defined solely through damage. Yet nature is not as clear-cut as black and white. Truths are usually hidden in gray areas. Everything in this video may cause you to rethink many of the things you believe you know about the wild boar, because what is told here is not merely the story of an animal. It is the story of humanity's relationship with nature, its fears, its attempt to draw boundaries, and its frequent inability to confront the problems it has created. The wild boar is not a symbol in this story. It is an active subject, a silent but powerful actor. This animal, roaming the depths of forests, does not merely survive, it shapes its surroundings. It roots through the soil, alters vegetation, and indirectly affects the living spaces of other creatures. Where it passes, nature does not remain the same, but it does not disappear either. It transforms, and this transformation is a reality that humans often prefer not to see, because everything that cannot be controlled is disturbing to the modern world. The strength of the wild boar is not found only in its muscles. Its true power lies in its ability to adapt. As human settlements expand, it does not retreat but changes direction. It alters its timing, reorganizes its behavior, and learns risks. This learning does not make it more visible but more cautious, and perhaps that is exactly why fear of it continues to grow without diminishing, because everything that is conscious is considered unpredictable. Throughout this video, you will see step by step why the wild boar is so deeply misunderstood. You will realize why it is labeled as aggressive, why it is declared a pest, and which human behaviors lie behind these labels. At the same time, you will come to know its social structure, its intelligence, its memory, and the delicate balance it maintains with nature. Because the wild boar does not walk alone, it clings to its environment with invisible bonds. Perhaps the most unsettling question is this: did the wild boar really change, or did we? When forests shrink, roads divide landscapes, and silence turns into noise, does nature become aggressive, or humanity become more vulnerable? The answer to this question is not only about the wild boar, it is about how much space humans occupy in the world they have created. As you watch this video, you will realize that the information you encounter is not merely a documentary narrative. This narrative was designed to slowly shift your perspective, because sometimes the real danger is not an animal emerging from the forest. The real danger is defining nature solely through our needs. The wild boar is still there, in the forest, at the edge of fields, in the silence of the night. It neither challenges us nor flees from us. It simply exists, and perhaps it reminds us of this: no living being in nature exists solely for our comfort. This story is beginning now. Are you ready to listen? The wild boar is one of the oldest witnesses of human history.
This powerful mammal, which has existed in the depths of forests, along the edges of swamps, at the foothills of mountains, and eventually near agricultural lands, has shared the same geography with humans for thousands of years. Despite this, the true nature of the wild boar is still largely misunderstood. For most people, the wild boar is an animal known for sudden attacks, uncontrolled, dangerous, and causing only harm. Yet this perception ignores the complex balances of nature and the place of the wild boar within that balance. The wild boar is not only a powerful animal, it is also intelligent, social, highly adaptable, and a creature that plays a vital role in the functioning of ecosystems.
Scientifically known as Sus scrofa, the wild boar is one of the most widely distributed species among mammals. It inhabits a vast geography stretching from Europe to Asia, from North Africa to the Far East. Its ability to survive in such diverse climates and habitats is the clearest indicator of its evolutionary success. It is one of the rare large mammals capable of living in cold mountain forests, warm Mediterranean coasts, rain-heavy tropical regions, or semi-arid areas. This adaptability stems not only from physical resilience, but also from behavioral flexibility. Although the body of the wild boar may appear coarse and clumsy at first glance, this structure is in fact extremely functional. Its thick skin is covered with stiff and dense bristles. These bristles protect it from both cold and external threats. The dense muscle structure beneath its skin gives the wild boar great strength. This strength is often misinterpreted and associated with aggression, yet this power is primarily for survival and defense. Wild boars are not predators. They do not ambush or select targets. However, when they perceive a threat, especially when escape routes are blocked, they can react with extreme force. One of the most striking physical features of the wild boar is its teeth. Particularly in males, the long canine teeth in both the lower and upper jaws curve outward as they grow. These teeth serve as symbols of status and tools of defense in nature. They play a decisive role in struggles between males. However, these confrontations are rarely fatal. The goal is not to kill the rival, but to assert dominance. Nature's internal order has evolved in a way that prevents unnecessary destruction. Intelligence is one of the most overlooked traits of the wild boar. Research shows that wild boars possess problem-solving abilities more developed than those of many mammals. They can rapidly adapt to complex environmental conditions, learn dangers, and store them in memory. Learning to avoid traps set in an area, adjusting activity times according to human presence, and strategically using food sources are concrete indicators of this intelligence. This makes them a species that is difficult to control, but this is a result of intelligence, not malicious intent. Wild boars are social animals. They usually live in groups. These groups mostly consist of females and offspring. Males leave the group after reaching a certain age and live more solitary lives. However, during mating seasons, they approach the groups again. The social structure within the group is highly organized. There is a quiet but clear hierarchy among females. Offspring are protected not only by their mothers, but also by other females in the group. This collective defense approach significantly increases the survival rate of wild boar young. When they are born, piglets have striped coats. These stripes provide excellent camouflage with the forest floor. Over time, the stripes disappear and they transition into their adult appearance. In the first months, piglets are extremely vulnerable. For this reason, the group forms a tighter defensive circle around them. In moments of danger, the piglets are placed at the center while adults form the outer ring. This behavior is one of the rare examples of high-level social coordination in nature. In terms of diet, wild boars are omnivores. That is, they feed on both plant and animal matter. Roots, tubers, fruits, seeds, mushrooms, and agricultural crops make up the majority of their diet. In addition, they consume insects, worms, small invertebrates, and occasionally carrion. This broad diet makes them important actors in the cleaning and renewal processes of ecosystems. Their rooting behavior aerates the soil and contributes to seed dispersal. This behavior plays a critical role in the regeneration of forest ecosystems. However, this feeding behavior is also one of the main causes of conflict with humans. Agricultural lands are extremely attractive food sources for wild boars. Crops grown by humans are high in calories and easily accessible, drawing the attention of wild boars. Conflicts arising at this point often lead to the wild boar being labeled as a pest, yet this situation is a direct result of the narrowing of natural habitats. As forests shrink and natural food sources decline, wild boars are forced to approach human settlements more frequently. Stories about wild boar attacks are also often taken out of context. Statistically, attacks by wild boars on humans are quite rare. The majority of these incidents occur due to the animal's instinct to protect its young or as a result of sudden encounters. Especially in dense forest areas, humans approaching without noticing the animal can create a no-escape situation for the wild boar. In such cases, the defensive reflex is triggered. However, this is not a planned attack, but an instantaneous reaction. Historically, the wild boar has held an important place in many cultures. From ancient times through the Middle Ages, it was seen as a symbol of strength, courage, and resistance. It appears frequently in mythologies, coats of arms, and legends. Its difficulty to hunt made it a noble target. However, in the modern world, this symbolic value has largely been forgotten and replaced by narratives of fear and conflict.
Today, wild boars face threats such as increasing human population, habitat loss, and climate change. The fragmentation of forests, the disruption of natural corridors, and the expansion of agricultural lands restrict the movement areas of wild boars. This situation means more conflict for both animals and humans. Climate change, on the other hand, indirectly alters the behavior of wild boars by affecting food cycles and water resources. Despite this, wild boars continue to be one of nature's most resilient species. Their ability to adapt to harsh conditions increases their chances of survival. However, this resilience is not limitless. Uncontrolled hunting, unconscious interventions, and incorrect management policies can lead to serious declines in local populations. For this reason, understanding wild boars does not only mean controlling them, but protecting the ecosystem as a whole. The wild boar is neither a monster nor a pest in nature. It is a natural part of the ecosystem in which it exists. It shapes the soil, affects vegetation, and forms complex relationships with other living beings. Its absence does not only mean the loss of a single species, but the disruption of a balance. Therefore, our perspective on the wild boar should not be fear-based, but knowledge-based. Understanding nature begins with understanding its most misunderstood creatures. The wild boar is one of the foremost among them. This powerful animal that silently roams through forests actually carries one of the clearest messages nature offers us. Every living being that adapts, maintains balance, and whose boundaries are respected deserves its place on this planet. The wild boar is living proof of this truth. The presence of the wild boar in nature is not limited to physical effects alone. Its true impact on the ecosystem emerges in processes that are invisible but decisive in the long term. Its rooting behavior is not merely a search for food. This behavior changes the microbial structure of the soil, brings organic matter to the surface, and creates conditions for many plant species to sprout again. Leaves, branches, and decayed organic materials accumulating on the forest floor are broken down and mixed into the soil through the movements of wild boars. This process contributes to the acceleration of nutrient cycles and increases soil fertility. Many scientific studies show that plant diversity gradually decreases in forest areas where wild boars are absent. This is because the soil surface hardens, seed germination becomes more difficult, and certain plant species become dominant. The presence of the wild boar breaks this monotony. By continuously rooting in different spots, it creates microhabitats. These microhabitats mean new living spaces for insects, fungi, small mammals, and reptiles. In other words, the wild boar directly and indirectly affects the life cycles of dozens of species. For this reason, the wild boar is classified among species known in ecology as ecosystem engineers. This term refers to a living being that determines the living conditions of other species by physically altering its environment. Beavers take on this role by building dams, elephants by knocking down trees. The wild boar performs this engineering by shaping the soil.
Its absence, even if not immediately noticeable, can fundamentally change the character of a forest over the years. This relationship that the wild boar establishes with nature forms a sharp contrast with the relationship it establishes with humans. For humans, order, boundaries, and control are essential. Agricultural lands are defined, crops are planted in rows, and the soil is desired to remain as stable as possible. The wild boar, by its very nature, disrupts this order. In its view, soil is a living system that must be rooted. These two perspectives inevitably conflict. However, this conflict does not arise because the wild boar is wrong, but because of humanity's desire to shape nature according to its own rules. At this point, the process of wild boars approaching urbanization and human settlements comes into play. In recent years, the sighting of wild boars in city centers, suburbs, and even park areas across regions from Europe to Asia has caused surprise. However, this is not a sudden behavioral change. Wild boars are extremely flexible animals that carefully observe human activities and adapt their behavior accordingly. Cities that become quiet at night turn into low-risk areas for them. Garbage areas, gardens, and green spaces offer easily accessible food sources. There is an important point that must be emphasized here. Wild boars do not invade cities. They fill existing ecological gaps. The decline of natural predators, the fragmentation of forests, and the abundance of human-generated food push these animals towards the edges of cities. This situation is once again a result created by humans, not by wild boars. When the behavior of wild boars is examined, it is seen that they are extremely cautious even in urban environments. They avoid direct encounters with humans. They shift their movement times to the quietest hours of the night. They stay away from noise, light, and sudden movements. These behaviors clearly show that they are not aggressive, but rather risk-averse creatures. However, this cautious structure can quickly turn into defense during sudden encounters. Especially females with offspring act with the same instincts, even in urban settings.
The reproductive cycle of wild boars is also of critical importance in understanding their population dynamics. Females usually give birth once a year and can deliver between 4 and 8 offspring in a single litter. Under suitable conditions, this number can increase even further. This high reproductive potential gives rise to the perception that wild boars reproduce uncontrollably. However, in nature, this is balanced by high juvenile mortality rates. Predators, diseases, and environmental challenges keep the population within natural limits. The problem begins when these balancing factors are eliminated by humans. The extermination of large predators weakens the natural control mechanisms of wild boars. At the same time, the abundant food provided by agricultural lands increases juvenile survival rates. This leads to population growth. In other words, what is perceived as overpopulation is actually an indicator of ecosystem disruption. At this point, hunting policies come into play. In many countries, wild boars are heavily hunted under the justification of population control. However, scientific data show that uncontrolled and unplanned hunting often produces the opposite effect. Populations under pressure begin to reproduce at earlier ages and give birth to more offspring. This biological response is part of the species' survival strategy. Therefore, short-term solutions can enlarge the problem in the long term. Changing perceptions about wild boars is possible not only through scientific knowledge, but also through cultural perspective. In many societies, the wild boar is associated with negative connotations. However, for much of human history, this animal has been a respected figure. In ancient myths, it appeared as a symbol of courage, strength, and resilience. This symbolism shows that the role of the wild boar in nature was intuitively recognized. Modern humans, on the other hand, try to understand nature by dividing it into pieces. They create sharp categories such as useful and harmful. The wild boar does not fit into these categories because it can both provide benefits and create problems. However, this duality does not exist in nature itself. Nature consists of networks of relationships. The wild boar is an important node within this network. The future of the wild boar will also determine the direction of humanity's relationship with nature. If we continue to see it only as a threat, conflict is inevitable. But
But if we begin to understand it, analyze its behavior, and plan living spaces accordingly, ways of coexistence are possible. Corridor areas, buffer zones, conscious agricultural practices, and ecosystem-based management approaches are the keys to this coexistence. The wild boar is a warning offered to us by nature. It shows the consequences of uncontrolled growth, limitless expansion, and short-term thinking. Every conflict experienced with it is actually a reflection of a much larger conflict with nature. Therefore, understanding the wild boar is not merely about understanding a single species. It is a step toward understanding humanity's own nature. This powerful animal that silently roams through forests and roots through the soil in the darkness of night reminds us of nature's fundamental rule. No living being is independent of the system it inhabits. The wild boar and humans are both parts of the same network. Breaking this network weakens not just one side, but the whole. The position of the wild boar in human perception has largely been shaped by fear-based narratives. The origin of this fear is based not only on real experiences, but also on stories passed from mouth to mouth, exaggerated accounts of events, and selectively presented images in the media. Moments when a wild boar enters a city center are often presented out of context. The reasons why that animal came there and the environmental pressures under which it was acting are rarely questioned. Thus, the wild boar is perceived not as the result of a problem, but as the problem itself. However, when the behaviors of wild boars are examined, it is seen that they are extremely sensitive to environmental changes. Noise, human density, light pollution, and sudden movements are sources of stress for these animals. In their natural environments, they live quiet, balanced, and rhythmic lives. They feed, rest, and engage in intragroup interactions at specific times of the day. When this rhythm is disrupted, when human activities expand into natural areas, inevitable changes occur in the behavior of wild boars as well.
These changes are often described as habituation. It is said that wild boars have become accustomed to humans and therefore fearless. However, this expression does not fully reflect the truth. Wild boars do not become accustomed to humans, they reassess risk. If human presence is high in an area but direct threat is low, they begin to use that area. This is not fearlessness, but adaptation. The same animal can quickly retreat at the slightest perception of threat and may avoid that area for a long time. The memory capacity of wild boars comes into play at this point. They remember negative experiences for a long time. Hunting pressure, trap experiences, or violent encounters in a particular area can cause that area to be abandoned for an extended period. This demonstrates how highly developed their capacity for environmental learning is. However, this learning does not always result in outcomes that favor humans, because while wild boars avoid risky areas, they tend to move towards safer areas that are often closer to human settlements. When mismanaged, this cycle becomes a growing problem. Humans increase pressure to drive wild boars away. Wild boars, in turn, move toward different and unexpected areas. In this process, the real loser is both sides. Animals live under stress, while humans develop greater fear and anger due to increased encounters. The communication methods of wild boars are also extremely important for understanding their social structure. These animals use many vocal and silent signals. Grunts, growls, short and sharp sounds form the basis of intragroup communication. In addition, body language is extremely pronounced. Ear position, head posture, and body tension convey clear messages about intent. These signals reduce conflicts within the group and prevent unnecessary fights. Humans, however, often misinterpret these signals. A wild boar's growl or sudden movement is perceived directly as an attack, yet these behaviors are usually warnings. The animal wants distance to be maintained. When these warnings are ignored, defensive behavior becomes inevitable. For this reason, the majority of negative encounters with wild boars stem from a lack of communication. The sensory perceptions of wild boars are also highly developed. Especially their sense of smell sets them apart from many mammals. They can detect food beneath the soil from kilometers away. This powerful sense of smell also allows them to detect danger early. Human scent is a clear warning signal for wild boars. For this reason, in natural environments, they usually avoid humans long before being seen. However, factors such as wind direction, terrain structure, and noise can disrupt this perception. The sense of sight in wild boars is more limited compared to their other senses. However, their motion perception is extremely strong.
Sudden movements, especially in low light conditions, are perceived as strong threat signals. This is again one of the main reasons for tension during sudden encounters. The lifespan of these animals under natural conditions averages between 10 and 15 years. However, this duration can be significantly shortened depending on environmental pressures. Hunting pressure, traffic accidents, diseases, and habitat loss directly affect the lifespan of wild boars. In particular, roads dividing natural habitats pose a serious threat to these animals. Because they are active at night, vehicle collisions are frequent, and this can result in fatal outcomes for both humans and animals. The relationship between wild boars and diseases is also often misunderstood. These animals can be carriers of certain diseases. However, this does not make them dangerous. Nearly every living organism in nature is associated with certain pathogens. The real problem is humans increasing these contacts by narrowing natural habitats. Intensive livestock activities, uncontrolled waste, and the disruption of natural cycles raise disease risks. This risk is not unique to wild boars. The eradication or excessive pressure on wild boars does not eliminate these risks. On the contrary, it creates new imbalances in the ecosystem. Natural systems do not tolerate emptiness. The withdrawal of one species leads to the emergence of other species or different behavioral patterns. For this reason, solutions regarding wild boars require a holistic perspective. Understanding the role of the wild boar in nature also allows humans to rethink their own role in nature. Humans often position themselves at the center of nature. They evaluate other species based on their impact on this center. The wild boar challenges this perspective. It can neither be fully controlled nor completely ignored. It's part of a system with its own rules. This reality can be uncomfortable because it undermines the illusion of control, but it is also instructive. The wild boar shows that the relationship with nature cannot be one-sided. Adaptation, mutual understanding, and acceptance of boundaries form the foundation of this relationship.
The future of wild boars depends on the decisions humans make. When science-based, long-term, and ethical approaches are adopted, it is possible to live alongside this species. However, short-term, fear-based, and punitive policies only deepen the problem. For this reason, the wild boar is not a problem. It is an indicator. It is a living sign that shows where the ecosystem is under strain, which balances have been disrupted, and how human activities are reflected in nature. Understanding it is possible by reading these signs correctly. The relationship between wild boars and humans is not only a matter of the present day. This relationship dates back to the earliest periods when agriculture began. When humans started cultivating the soil, the wild boar was one of the first species to notice this change. Plowed soil, newly sprouting plants, dense food sources, all of these created attractive opportunities for the wild boar. At this point, conflict became inevitable. Humans wanted to produce, wild boars wanted to survive. Both sides acted in accordance with their own nature. Throughout history, narratives about the wild boar have carried the traces of this conflict. In ancient texts, the wild boar is often depicted as a trial, an obstacle, or a challenge. It becomes a being through which heroes must prove their strength. However, these narratives do not stem from the wild boar being evil, but from it not being easy prey. The human mind tends to perceive what it cannot control as a threat. The wild boar is one of the historical victims of this perception. In the modern era, this perception has taken a different form. Instead of mythological narratives, headlines, social media videos, and urban legends now dominate. The sighting of a wild boar in a residential area during daylight hours is quickly described as an invasion, yet the reasons behind this situation are often ignored. Drying water sources, destroyed forest fragments, natural areas filled with noise. The wild boar actually delivers a direct message to us. The natural balance has been disrupted. The reproductive potential of wild boars is also one of the topics frequently misinterpreted. It is said that these animals reproduce rapidly and therefore increase uncontrollably. However, the reproductive rates of wild boars are extremely dependent on environmental conditions. If food is abundant, birth rates increase. If there is scarcity, they decrease. Nature has its own internal balancing mechanism, but when humans disrupt this mechanism, the outcomes also become unbalanced. The constant and intensive food source provided by agricultural lands affects the reproductive strategies of wild boars. This situation is not overpopulation by the animals, but a response to an artificial abundance created by humans. The behavioral flexibility of wild boars distinguishes them from many mammals. The same individual can exhibit completely different behaviors in different environments. In areas with intense human pressure, they become more nocturnal, more cautious, and quieter. In areas with less human pressure, they may be more relaxed, more visible, and more social. This flexibility forms the basis of their survival strategy. However, this leads them to being labeled as animals that can adapt everywhere and therefore know no boundaries. This labeling shifts responsibility onto the animal and renders human impact invisible. The effects of wild boars on the ecosystem are not limited to rooting the soil. Their roles within the food web indirectly affect many species. They contribute to seed dispersal, regulate insect populations, and prevent certain plant species from becoming dominant. These effects are not noticed in the short term, but in the long term, they shape the structure of the ecosystem. A system without wild boars takes on a different and often more fragile structure. For this reason, in regions where wild boars have been completely eliminated or placed under intense pressure, unexpected outcomes emerge. Some plant species spread uncontrollably, certain insect populations increase, and soil structure changes. While humans believe they have solved a problem, they actually create a chain of more complex problems. Nature does not favor simple solutions. Every intervention brings multiple consequences. Management policies regarding wild boars are critically important at this point. Practices that are not based on scientific data and that provide only short-term relief do not permanently solve the problem. On the contrary, they make animal behavior more unpredictable. Populations under constant pressure become more dispersed and spread over wider areas. This can increase rather than decrease human wild boar encounters. Examples applied in different parts of the world clearly demonstrate this reality. In some countries, methods like habitat protection, creating movement corridors, and regulating human activities have been successfully implemented. In these regions, conflicts with wild boars have decreased, and populations have become more balanced. This shows that the problem is not the existence of the animal, but the way of coexistence. The presence of the wild boar in nature is like a test for humans. It requires patience, knowledge, and long-term thinking. Although easy solutions may seem attractive, nature eventually demands the price of these solutions. The wild boar is one of the most visible symbols of this price.
Understanding this animal is not limited to learning its biological characteristics alone. At the same time, it requires humans to question their own behaviors, consumption habits, and the relationship they have established with nature. The wild boar tells us this directly. I am here because you are here. I am this way because you created a world like this. This message may be uncomfortable. However, facing reality is often uncomfortable. Silencing or eliminating the wild boar does not erase this message. It only means we close our eyes to avoid hearing it. The relationship wild boars establish with nature is not limited to merely using their environment. They also transform it. This transformation, when compared to human intervention, is much slower, far more balanced, and reversible. A wild boar rooting through the soil in search of food may appear destructive at first glance. However, this action aerates the top layer of the soil, increases the activity of microorganisms, and enables the redistribution of organic matter. This process is extremely valuable for keeping the soil alive, especially in forest ecosystems. Unlike intensive soil processing carried out by human hands, the impact of the wild boar is patchy. That is, it affects selected areas rather than every part of the landscape. This allows nature to preserve its own capacity for regeneration. This engineering effect of wild boars creates opportunities for many plant species. Seeds that gain a chance to sprout in rooted soil contribute to the diversification of understory vegetation. This diversity means new habitats for many living beings, from insects to birds. In other words, the presence of the wild boar is not a single isolated impact, but part of a cascading web of life. The breaking of this web disrupts the balance not of just one species, but of many. The
The tension between humans and wild boars is often evaluated solely through the lens of economic damage. Damage to agricultural fields, trampled crops, dug up lands, these are real problems and cannot be ignored. However, the way these problems are approached is decisive. Declaring the wild boar an enemy does not solve the problem, it merely pushes both sides into a harsher conflict. Scientific studies, on the other hand, show that preventative and guiding methods are far more effective. Physical barriers, changes in crop patterns, natural deterrents, and habitat management methods can significantly reduce conflict. Wild boars approaching human settlements is rarely coincidental. These animals constantly observe and evaluate their surroundings. They learn where it is safe and where it is risky. In areas with intense human activity, they usually prefer nighttime hours. This creates the perception that they move secretly. However, this is a timing strategy they have developed to survive. Humans are active during the day, so wild boars choose the night. This shows us one thing clearly. The wild boar does not imitate humans, it adapts to humans. This ability to adapt has even led to wild boars being seen on the edges of cities. Parks, green spaces, and even some suburban areas can turn into temporary living spaces for wild boars. This situation is disturbing for modern humans because there's a habit of confining nature within certain boundaries. The idea that nature starts here and ends here clashes with boundary-crossing species like the wild boar. However, this conflict is not nature's fault. The perceptual world of wild boars is also often misunderstood. Their sense of sight is not as developed as that of humans. However, their sense of smell and hearing are extremely sensitive. A wild boar can detect a scent from kilometers away. This trait keeps it constantly alert. Sudden noises, unexpected movements, and especially the perception of a threat coming from behind quickly trigger defensive reflexes. Many incidents that humans describe as "it attacked suddenly" are in fact the result of a sudden threat interpretation within the animal's perceptual world. While the aggressiveness of wild boars is often exaggerated, their fear is overlooked. Yet wild boars also feel fear. They flee, hide, and change direction. However, when there is no escape route or when their offspring are in danger, they do not back down. This is true for many species in nature. The difference is this: the wild boar is strong, and it can use this strength when necessary. This makes it highly visible. The lifespan of wild boars in nature generally ranges between 10 and 15 years. The experiences they accumulate during this time directly influence their behavior. Individuals that have previously had negative experiences with humans become much more cautious. This transfer of experience is not only individual, but also spreads within the herd through learning. In other words, a herd can remember that a particular area is risky. This collective memory enables wild boars to develop long-term strategies. At this point, another consequence of human intervention emerges. Populations that are constantly disturbed become more stressed and more unpredictable. Stress affects not only behavior, but also reproduction and the immune system. This can increase the risk of disease spread. In other words, human-wild boar conflict produces not only physical, but also biological consequences. Narratives claiming that wild boars are disease carriers are also often taken out of context. Yes, they can carry certain diseases. However, this alone is not sufficient to label them as dangerous. The same risk applies to many wild and domestic animals. The determining factor here is uncontrolled contact and improper livestock practices. With proper management, these risks can be greatly reduced. Fear-based discourse surrounding wild boars is often fueled by a lack of knowledge. Humans fear what they do not know. They try to control what they fear. What they cannot control, they choose to eliminate. This cycle has produced destructive results for many species throughout history. The wild boar is one of the living beings still trapped within this cycle. Yet understanding the wild boar requires redefining the relationship humans have established with nature. Nature is not merely a resource to be consumed, it is a system to coexist with. The wild boar is one of the noisy but indispensable components of this system. Silencing it means turning down the volume of the system itself.